Oh, it looks like Zoe was disconnected to audio briefly. So I will go ahead and start the presentation. My name is Megan Ward, and I am a program associate for the Mosaics project. Today we have two of our training and advisory board members, Evelyn Jimbo and Colleen Owens, to present on labor trafficking. Mosaics is a project of the Justice Programs Office at American University, and we are funded by the Office for Victims of Crime. This is a disclaimer slide to let you know that the opinions and the ideas expressed here are not necessarily the opinions of the U.S. Department of Justice or the Office for Victims of Crime. If you've never heard of us before, we are a training and technical assistance project to help criminal courts identify survivors of human trafficking who are facing criminal charges, so survivor defendants, and respond to those survivor defendants with a range of outcomes in their cases and a continuum of social service referrals. If you would like to receive training and technical assistance from us, personalized for your jurisdiction or your court, please feel free to email us at mosaics@american.edu or visit our website. As I said at the top of this presentation, we have two of our amazing training and advisory board members to share their expertise in labor trafficking. I'll let each of them introduce themselves more thoroughly, but first we'll have Colleen Owens, who is a researcher and has done extensive research on labor trafficking in particular. Then after her presentation concludes, we'll hear from Evelyn Jimbo, who is herself a survivor of labor trafficking and now works in the advocacy realm to help train folks like us. So with that,
hey, Megan,
I will turn it over to
Zoe.
Colleen.
Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you now, Zoe.
Oh my goodness, thanks. I am so sorry about that technical issue I was having. Thanks so much for starting us off, Megan.
No problem.
I was able to hear some of the introduction you gave, and I so appreciate it. And it summarizes a lot of what I was going to say. I'll just add a few notes. One is that we're really excited to be talking about understanding and responding to labor trafficking, particularly because Mosaics is dedicated to a very specific space, which is responding to human trafficking in the context of criminal courts. And while we know that an estimated 25 million people are labor trafficked worldwide, there are really no specific responses to labor trafficking survivors who are facing criminal charges that we can point to that are being employed in the criminal court context. While there are dozens of courts in the United States that have developed human trafficking intervention programs that theoretically serve both sex and labor trafficking survivors are simply not being identified and therefore are not being assisted or connected to services at the same rate that sex trafficking survivors are. Accordingly, not only have best practices not been developed with respect to responding to labor trafficking survivors facing criminal charges, very few practices, period, have been developed to respond to labor trafficking survivors in criminal court settings. So our hope is that this webinar will help court stakeholders start thinking of ways that they can develop practices that effectively identify and assist labor trafficking survivors facing criminal charges. So we're really hoping that all the court stakeholders who are listening to this webinar can not only spend this time listening and learning, but also to do some brainstorming about how they will apply this information to their own personal court context. We will begin the webinar with Colleen providing a thorough overview of the research to date regarding labor trafficking, its prevalence, and the characteristics of survivors. And Evelyn Jimbo will share her experiences as a labor trafficking survivor and her recommendations for courts based on her experience. And then we'll come back to me at the end, and I'll wrap up the webinar discussing what we have learned from research on prostitution diversion courts and some suggestions based on that we have for courts hoping to craft innovative responses to labor trafficking. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to our presenters. Colleen, you're up first.
Thank you so much, Zoe, Megan, and Evelyn, and for inviting me to present with you today. And thank you for everyone on the webinar for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here. Just quickly, by way of a bit of background, as Megan and Zoe mentioned, I'm a researcher by training. We may or may not have crossed paths in the past. For the majority of my research career, I was with Urban Institute as a senior research associate, co-directing our portfolio of human trafficking research, both in the United States as well as several countries internationally. The large majority of the research I conducted was funded by the National Institute of Justice, State Department, Bureau of Justice Assistance, and Bureau of Justice Statistics. Another part of the work I've done for many years and continue to do is training and technical assistance with the federally funded human trafficking task forces, and also through this project with American. Though I'm not currently full-time with Urban anymore, I now run my own nonprofit organization called The Y, and I continue to engage in the field regarding human trafficking research and technical assistance. So I just wanted to clarify that. As you'll hear, I'll be referencing some studies that I was involved in the past when I was at Urban Institute. So my goal today is to present you with reliable information we have to date regarding research on human trafficking, and specifically labor trafficking, which, as you may or may not know, and as Zoe referenced, is an area we suffer from a dearth of information on as a field. And it's particularly acute, I would say almost non-existent, within criminal court settings. So I'm grateful to you all that you're here today. And looking forward to working together and coming up with some potential solutions to this issue. So I will begin with the $64 million question, which is prevalence. The best prevalence estimate we have thus far is from the International Labor Office, which estimates that on any given day, there are 25 million individuals in forced labor worldwide, 16 million of whom are victims of forced labor exploitation in economic activities such as agriculture, construction, domestic work, and manufacturing, 4.8 million of whom are victims of forced sexual exploitation, and 4.1 million victims of forced labor imposed by state authorities. Although there are statistics out there about the prevalence of human trafficking in the United States, please do not believe them. Currently, there is no scientifically reliable overall prevalence estimate of human trafficking, either labor trafficking or sex trafficking in the United States. However, as I'll present later, there are a few reliable prevalence estimates of labor trafficking within certain industries and certain subgroups of the population. But before we talk about those, let's talk about how we define labor trafficking in the United States. So within the United States, we have laws defining human trafficking at the federal and state levels. Human trafficking was first codified under law federally in 2000 when the TVPA, or Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act, was passed. And every few years, the law is reauthorized and the definition may be amended, as well as other changes introduced. The law includes separate definitions of sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And I've listed the definition here of sex trafficking: the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting of a person for the purposes of a commercial sex act, in which the commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act has not attained 18 years of age. And there is this distinction with sex trafficking between minors. So it's for those over the age of 18, you have to prove the force, fraud, or coercion. For those under 18, you do not. And the theory behind that is because a person is not considered legally able to consent to commercial sex acts if they're under the age of 18. When you look at the definition of labor trafficking under federal law, we don't have that same distinction. So with the age. So labor trafficking is defined as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt, bondage, or slavery. And you're probably eyes are maybe raised around this definition. It is rooted in the principles of the 13th Amendment. And I know it can be a little bit intimidating to try to figure out what does this all mean, especially with how do you define and recognize it if it occurs in your courtroom. And I'll get more into that later. So states soon followed the federal government, and most started passing laws around 2006. By 2013, all states had laws against human trafficking. However, despite efforts to create uniform laws, some of those efforts I was involved in, definitions of human trafficking and criminal penalties vary across states. So, for example, some states may not define human trafficking as including labor trafficking, and some state definitions of human trafficking may be broader or more narrow than the federal law. Which can create issues with prosecutions, identification for services, and so on, as you can imagine. While there is no reliable overall prevalence estimate of labor trafficking in the United States, there have been a few studies that offer prevalence estimates of labor trafficking within narrowly focused industries or certain populations. So the first is the study of homeless youth by the University of Pennsylvania and Loyola University. They interviewed 911 youth, defined by the study as ages 17 through 25 across 13 cities in the United States and Canada. And they found that nearly 20% of the youth were victims of human trafficking, with about 7% trafficked for labor and 3% trafficked for both labor and sex. In situations of forced labor, they found the study included youth who were forced to work in factories, domestic labor situations, agriculture, international drug smuggling, sex trade-related labor, and commission-based sales. And the vast majority, about 81% of those labor trafficking cases, were instances of forced drug dealing, which occurred through familial and cultural coercion, as well as through violence of suppliers and gangs. Moving on to the next study, our best estimate of labor trafficking within an undocumented migrant population comes from a 2012 study by Sheldon Zhang. And this study used a technique called respondent-driven sampling, like a snowball sampling method, to estimate the size of labor trafficking within the undocumented Spanish-speaking migrant labor population of San Diego County. So it's, a population within a population within a population. But it was very rigorous in terms of the methodology and reliable. And they found that of 826 migrant laborers, 30% experienced labor trafficking, so meeting that federal definition we used as the standard, and 55% experienced labor abuses, and I'll get into that later, but those would fall more under our civil labor exploitation penalties. So there's sort of the criminal labor trafficking, and then there are all these other types of labor abuses that actually fall under our civil Department of Labor jurisdiction. And then finally, there was a study with Sheldon and some researchers from RTI of labor trafficking among farm workers in North Carolina, and they found something very similar, that using similar research methodology, a quarter of the participants had experienced a situation that reached a threshold of labor trafficking, and 39% had experienced other forms of abuse, which would include denial of pay or deception of wages. All right, go to the next slide. Sorry, the slide will be advanced. It's getting stuck over here for some reason. I don't know, Megan, if you can advance it to the next. There we go. Okay, but we do know that, there are some indications that reporting of potential labor trafficking is on the rise. If we look at tips that are being called in to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and this is the most recent data that we have, they received reports of, in fiscal year 2016, around 8,000 unique cases of potential trafficking, and 14% of those, around 1,000 of those cases, are situations of potential labor trafficking, which was actually a 47% increase over the previous year. And the top 3 labor trafficking types reported in that data were domestic work, agriculture, and traveling sales crews. And according to hotline data, potential labor trafficking victims are both foreign nationals as well as U.S. citizens, adults and minors, males, females, and individuals who identify as transgender and gender nonconforming. On to the next slide. Despite increasing tips to the hotline, the number of reported investigations, prosecutions, and victims served remains comparatively low, or in many cases unknown. Federal investigation statistics are reported annually in the Trafficking in Persons report by the State Department and the U.S. Attorney General's report to Congress on human trafficking. And the most recent versions of both reports actually do not disaggregate data on human trafficking investigations by labor trafficking and sex trafficking. So it's unclear how many labor trafficking investigations were undertaken by federal law enforcement agencies. Available data on federal prosecutions of labor trafficking, along with prior research on challenges investigating labor trafficking that I've conducted and others, would cause one to believe the number of labor trafficking investigations is fairly low, and lower for sure than the number of sex trafficking investigations. According to the 2019 TIP report, there were 17 prosecutions of labor trafficking by Department of Justice in fiscal year 18, and an unspecified number of prosecutions of cases involving both labor and sex trafficking. And then in fiscal year 18, DOJ secured 25 convictions against labor traffickers. Next slide. Human trafficking may also be investigated and prosecuted at the state and local levels in addition to the federal levels. In 2013, the FBI added human trafficking to its uniform crime reporting system, which was the first time an offense had been added since arson. It was added in the 70s, so it was a pretty big deal. The system, though, doesn't have 100% participation by jurisdictions across the country. There was no initial training that was rolled out with that system, so that's important to highlight that as you're looking at that data and considering it in that context. In fiscal year 2016, the most recent year they have reported, data indicated all states with the exception of Texas and Colorado reporting under 7 involuntary servitude offenses, which would be what we would look at for labor trafficking. Most states reported none. Since there's no then universal data collection system for state and local prosecutions, we don't know the total number of state and local labor trafficking prosecutions either. So you can see all these issues with our data collection, and that all feeds into, pieces of the prevalence, but really we don't have a total number that we can rely on. But based on prior research, chances are likely that the number of cases investigated and prosecuted as human trafficking represents the tip of an unknown-sized iceberg. In a study on challenges investigating and prosecuting state and local human trafficking cases conducted by Northeastern University in collaboration with colleagues and I at Urban, can you go back to the last slide? We found that of all the human trafficking investigations we looked at, 85% were for sex trafficking. That was clearly the priority, and there are reasons for that, and specifically within that, a further prioritization of child sex trafficking. And we found low victim self-report. They were low priority cases overall, sex and labor trafficking, particularly labor trafficking, and they were primarily reactive investigations, that there wasn't much proactive work going on to identify those cases at that time. We found that human trafficking laws, while they were on the books in the jurisdictions that we studied, they were just not being used, and there are a variety of reasons for that, and I would refer you to that final report. So now I'd like to move on and briefly present some core findings of a study my colleagues at Urban Institute and Northeastern University conducted on labor trafficking in the U.S. And I encourage you to check out the full report, which will be shared on the handout provided through this webinar. If you lose that, you can also download it for free at www.urban.org. So our report, next slide. Okay, I think it's working for me now. Was funded by the National Institute of Justice and conducted from 2012 to 2014 in collaboration with the Freedom Network. We designed the study to systematically analyze the use of force, fraud, or coercion, so those elements I mentioned earlier, throughout the continuum of the victim's labor trafficking experience, from the moment workers were recruited for jobs that became labor trafficking, to their travel, if any, to the U.S. for work, to the actual labor trafficked employment and their escape. And we sought to understand what labor trafficking looked like in as many different industries as possible. Our study was guided by three main research questions listed here. What is the nature of labor trafficking victimization in the U.S.? How are domestic and international labor trafficking syndicates organized? And what challenges does law enforcement face in investigating cases, and why do we see that so few cases identified by service providers get investigated or prosecuted by local or state law enforcement? So to do this, we coded 122 identified cases of labor trafficking across 4 study sites and conducted interviews with survivors, service providers, criminal and civil justice stakeholders at the local, state, and federal levels. It's important to mention one of the limitations of our study is that it's not nationally representative, but it does represent one of the most comprehensive studies of labor trafficking in the United States. We found that 100% of our sample were immigrant men, women, and children from all over the world. 29 different countries of origin. The top 6 countries were Mexico, the Philippines, Thailand, India, Indonesia, and Guatemala. Over half of the sample, 52%, had less than a high school degree, either having never attended formal school or having only some elementary or high school, and 33% had some college, or advanced degree or technical training. And that may be a function of some of the special visas that were being used to recruit some of the victims, which I'll talk about in a minute. 10% were minors when they were trafficked, and the average age that a person was at the time they were identified as having been labor trafficked was 33. And this was sometimes years or months to several years after they escaped the labor trafficking situation before they were identified. 64% of the sample had children. The top 5 industries individuals were trafficked in were domestic work, agriculture, hospitality, restaurants, and construction. The vast majority of our sample, 71%, entered the U.S. lawfully on a visa for the jobs they were recruited for and subsequently trafficked in. It's important to note that while 71% of the sample entered the U.S. lawfully on a visa, by the time they were identified as experiencing labor trafficking, that number was nearly opposite. So 69% were unauthorized at that point. And this was due to visas expiring, despite fraudulent promises by traffickers to extend them, or due to an individual losing lawful immigration status once they escaped the labor trafficking situation, since the visas were tied to that specific employer/trafficker. On this slide, you can see the most common visa types were H-2A visas for work in agriculture, H-2B for work in non-agriculture industries such as construction, restaurants, and hotels, and B-1, B-2 visas for purposes of business and tourism. The typical case scenario in our study involved a young man or woman learning about a job in the U.S. through their social network and then meeting with a recruitment agency operating abroad on behalf of U.S. employers. The recruitment agency would then engage in high levels of fraud and coercion, misrepresenting the job and benefits, and demanding recruitment fees. On average, our sample paid over $6,000, which is more than the average per capita income in the top 6 countries of origin, just to put that into context. To afford these fees, they would mortgage family property or take out high interest rate loans in their home countries. The vast majority of our sample, 71%, flew to the United States with visas obtained through meetings with embassy officials and cross-border checkpoints. Survivors described interviews with U.S. officials as routine and uneventful, with some interviews taking place in the presence of traffickers. Fraud and coercion were prevalent during the movement to the U.S. for work. 64% of trafficking victims had their documents seized during movement to the U.S. or soon after. This was highest for domestic servitude victims, 88% of whom had their documents seized by traffickers. I want to just caveat that movement is not a necessary legal element to prove labor trafficking, but to the extent it did occur, we wanted to understand whether force, fraud, or coercion were present. So once in the United States, workers were degraded and dehumanized, forced to labor for little or no pay, faced extortion, psychological coercion, and manipulation, were deprived food and medical care, lived in substandard and inhumane conditions, experienced sexual abuse and rape, attempted murder, and violence and threats against themselves and family members if they tried to leave. On average, individuals experienced more than 8 forms of victimization. As you can see in this visual, victims of labor trafficking experience high rates of labor exploitation, which is shaded in the light green, and which are civil violations, as well as high rates of the elements needed to prove force, fraud, or coercion for labor trafficking under federal law, indicated in the dark green. The fact that agencies responsible for investigating these crimes are separate, so DOL for the light green and local, state, and federal law enforcement for the dark green, indicates the need for more collaboration when investigating and prosecuting labor trafficking cases and providing services to victims. For workers here on a visa for the purpose of work, if they left their employer, they would lose their immigration status and become unauthorized. Employers, traffickers use this fact against workers, threatening them with arrest or deportation if they complained or tried to leave. Conversations with survivors indicated that the vast majority, about 94%, knew they were victimized but blamed themselves for what they commonly described as being tricked and experienced high levels of shame. Nearly all lacked knowledge that what they experienced was labor trafficking and that they had rights and protections in the U.S. regardless of immigration status. So the following 7 slides, I'm going to, in the interest of time, kind of breeze through those, because what they, and you can go back at your leisure and look through them and also reference the final report, which provides this detail, but they essentially break down the elements of force, fraud, or coercion. So what does that actually mean when you are prosecuting a case or trying to identify if someone has experienced this? So one of the first elements, depriving, disorienting, isolation, restricted communications, manipulation of debts, monitoring, and surveillance. And as you can see here on the right-hand side of the box, these are actual case examples. These are pulled from cases that we reviewed of identified labor trafficking. So just for you to read through those in the interest of time, and I'll just go through the elements. The next is threats or use of violence. So that could be physical, sexual, psychological, financial, reputational, harm to the family. One of the traffickers kept a handgun with him in the fields and shot and killed animals as a threat. Violently beating a young migrant worker, which was witnessed by other victims, forcing them to work when they were sick or threatening them with death when they were ill. Demeaning and demoralizing, using verbal abuse and humiliation. Diminishing resistance, so diminishing a person's resistance, their ability to leave, to feel that they are free to leave. And that is really key. Why did you feel you couldn't leave? That keeping people in substandard living conditions, denying food, water, medical care, weakening them with drugs or alcohol. Being fed spoiled food, living in rooms with 20 people, not being able to get treatment for medical conditions. Another example, intimidation and control. There's an atmosphere of violence, displaying weapons, rules, and punishments. We found 10% of cases there was evidence of attempted murder, display and actual firing of weapons, talking about access to weapons. Those are all examples. Threatening that they had ties to assassins in their home countries. So another is deception of consequences. So that's either that you're overstating the risks of leaving or the rewards for staying, that you feign power to authorities, to hitmen. And we really wanted to try to follow up on that to see whether those threats were followed up on, because you hear that quite a bit with labor trafficking cases, that there are threats to family members overseas. And we did find that some of those were carried through with. Another is use or threatened use of law. Threatening, this is a big one, to get victims deported or arrested, to turn them over to the police or immigration. And we did find out that this did happen in some cases, where there were ties or if there weren't, but they also called the police on the victim and blamed them for an assault, for example, after it was actually the trafficker that had hit the victim when they asked for pay. So that might be that is an area where there is some intersection potentially with some of what you will see. In terms of escape experiences, the majority of our sample, 59%, escaped on their own and lived several months or years before being properly identified. Very few, 7%, self-reported to police, and 14% of our sample were arrested, most commonly for immigration violations rather than being identified as victims of a crime. So with respect to suspects, we found 169 suspects associated with 104 of the 122 labor trafficking survivors in our study. 68% identified as male, 38% as female, approximately half U.S. citizens, half non-U.S. citizens. With respect to civil and criminal justice, we found that neither law enforcement nor Department of Labor were involved in proactively identifying labor trafficking, and as a result, we found no evidence of arrest for more than half of all traffickers identified, and victims were rarely awarded civil damages or criminal restitution. So given all the detail I just provided regarding what we know about labor trafficking looks like in the U.S., what do we know about the prevalence of human trafficking survivors, including both labor and sex trafficking survivors in criminal court? So we have a few studies that chip away at that answer, but it would be a worthwhile topic for future study. As I mentioned earlier, 14% of labor trafficking survivors in our study were arrested. In a study on survivors' perceptions of justice that I co-led with my colleague Jeanette Heathman at Urban, we found 35% of labor and sex trafficking survivors were defendants in a criminal case. In a past study with colleagues from Northeastern University and Urban on challenges investigating and prosecuting human trafficking, we found 35% of sex trafficking survivors were arrested, 11% of labor trafficking survivors, and 14% of survivors of both labor and sex trafficking. And commonly, they were arrested for charges as a result of their trafficking. So finally, I would like to provide you with links to existing screening tools in the field that have been tested and scientifically validated. Again, there are other ones out there, but these are the ones that have been tested and validated. But please note, none of these are specific to criminal court settings. They're also available on the handout that is provided through the webinar. And I'm happy to answer any questions at the end of this or after. So thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much, Colleen. And next up, we have Evelyn.
Thank you. Thank you, Colleen. Thank you, Megan and Zoe. And thank you all for attending this presentation. Colleen, wonderful job. I've always enjoyed, listening to you present on issues of labor trafficking. Again, my name is Evelyn Jimbo. Like Colleen probably said earlier, some of you probably have heard of my story and we've crossed paths. And I'm really happy that, the American Mosaic is doing this program and we're focusing on labor trafficking because it's something that I am passionate about, and I feel like sometimes it's always undermined when it comes to labor trafficking. Just like a lot of the research Colleen had mentioned, I'm just gonna share my experience as a survivor of labor trafficking, but precisely domestic servitude. Most of you have probably heard it so many times, the goal was to come to America and marry Will Smith, but that didn't happen. Maybe it can happen later on, we never know. So I came to the U.S. at age 9 and escaped my situation, age 7. And sometimes, like I said, when I think about my story, and I've shared my story so many times that I do my own research, kind of like Colleen. It's like, okay, this makes sense, that makes sense. And a lot of things are making sense the older I get and why this had happened and some of the things that I missed. And it helps me to educate you guys and to understand how to identify labor trafficking better. So I can't go. Okay. Oh, I went too far. All right, right here. Okay. So again, was trafficked from age 9 to 17. As you can see, I was very influenced by that little television. Now we have flat screen TV. That was one of the last pictures that I took while I was still in Cameroon, and that's my niece right there that I was carrying. And again, with the confusion of trafficking, I thought that I was coming in here to be with someone that was going to adopt me. Never did I think that I would come to the U.S. and be a survivor of, labor trafficking, domestic servitude, working at age 9, which there are more kids that are underage that have also survived the same situation. So this is me. That was my farewell party. Again, America, Europe, everybody get excited. My daughter is going to America. She's going to be a lawyer. she's going to be whatever and just help us back home. They never think about the consequences that is on the other side. So, all right, I'm going too fast. Do I have control? So again, like I said, I was very influenced by a lot of the television shows that you see right here. Will Smith, 90210, and The Cosby Show, because I just thought that was how America was. Never once, did I think that, I'll come to this country and be a survivor of trafficking at such a young age, or did not even go to school. And sometimes the media, even now, when we even look at the media, when it comes to human trafficking, the media only portrays a lot about sex trafficking more than labor trafficking, which I'm so glad that, we are talking more about this, and there are a lot of organizations that are doing more researches when it comes to labor trafficking. And I'm going to try to go, fast. So from labor trafficking, I survived domestic servitude and then got into foster care, which that was also another struggle. And I came to understand, about sex trafficking, because I almost got recruited, as a victim of sex trafficking in foster care. So I came to understand the whole sex trafficking in foster care too, which was great that Colleen had mentioned, sex and labor, because a lot of the times I feel that they cross-sex each other. There's always like people that are victims of labor trafficking are also sexually exploited a lot, and I think we always miss talking about that. We don't talk about the fact that there are kids, there are women and men that work in farms, and they're also being sexually exploited. And, I've met survivors that have experienced both. And I think that when we are addressing labor trafficking, we also have to talk about, them also being, the victims also being sexually exploited. And, Colleen presentation tells you a lot, like, the complaints from the communities, they're flags, they're things. I know sometimes we have folks that say it's so hard to identify labor trafficking. It's labor trafficking is hard. Again, most labor trafficking, Colleen gave the statistics. It's hard because a lot of the times there are foreigners and they don't understand the law. They're in another countries, and it's hard for them to just go out there and say, hey, I'm a victim of labor trafficking, which is good to really study and do the research, as Colleen has shown everyone perfectly, how doing the research and talking to survivors that have been there, because there are ways that we can get more victims out of more labor trafficking victims out there. That would, you can show the statistics. Every time I see the statistics, it shows more of like sex is higher and labor is there. That's because a lot of the times, again, they're foreigners and we don't understand, and even we are not able to know how to get the help, and we are afraid of being deported, which was mentioned in in Colleen's presentation. And I have put this here because I just thought it would be good to know this. It's good to know these different, approaches on ways to identify and how to work. Colleen mentioned it earlier, so I'm not going to try to repeat everything. You can look through the site. You can see, like for me, the most important is like collaboration, a collaboration and talking to survivors, like Colleen mentioned in her presentation, doing your research, working together as a community and just finding ways of helping victims getting out of the situation, especially if you're dealing with a labor trafficking case. I was, I felt in my case, they did, I know that not all labor trafficking, you have some successful labor trafficking cases, but I was very proud of the folks that were in my case because they collaborated together, the law enforcement and Homeland Security and my prosecutor, and the service provider, they worked together to try to get help for me. And I'm hoping that we can continue to have more of that collaboration when it comes to labor trafficking. Next slide. And again, I really want to emphasize when it comes to labor trafficking, I have heard a lot of presentation on labor trafficking, but a lot of times we don't talk about the trauma aspect out of it, which is something that I feel like we should not underestimate, labor trafficking victims and feel like they don't deal with the same trauma because, they're not sexually exploited or how, which I had mentioned earlier, they are sexually exploited and they suffer almost the same trauma as, as sex trafficking survivors. So we should also really consider that, they don't only have bruises, but in one of Colleen's slides, she mentioned, they're afraid that their trafficker might, their family might be attacked back home. I experienced that when I went and reported my situation. I experienced my trafficker saying that, hey, we're going to kill your family member back home. We're going to do that. All that lives in us. We also get beaten, just like the slaves that were in plantation. I was beaten day and night. I had to take off my clothes, bruises all over my body. And a lot of those effects as someone that had gone through that situation at such a young age is coming back as an adult, because even when I had my son, most people, they have kids, they get out of the hospital for 2-3 days. I was in the hospital for 2 weeks after giving birth to my son because of what I had endured at such a young age. So trauma is such a big part that we really have to also, emphasize and, talk about. Next slide. Oh. Went too far? Next. No, go back. Okay. So, there's different ways. Just everybody have their way of looking of what what does justice look like for me. Yes, I'm happy my case went through, but I feel like there was more that could be done. I'm happy, the immigration assistance, like I said, justice looks different for every survivor of trafficking. Especially labor trafficking, especially if you're a foreigner, justice for me was served, but I probably felt like justice would have been more better if I would have been able to reunite with my family. I didn't have to work for that on my own. And also, I would say restitution. I should have put that on this slide. It was said that restitution was given. There are some successful cases that, as far as labor trafficking, some were rewarded restitution, but the problem is they never get the money. And that's something that I will emphasize. If you're here, you're a lawyer, you're law enforcement, if that order was made, try to see how that victim can get their restitution. I would say that justice will be served if they had that. Next slide. And, we are fighting, we're here, we're using first-hand experience. We're working together with folks like Megan, Zoe, Colin, and so many organizations that I've worked with to just give you guys the first-hand experience. There are survivors that are sharing the different experience where you also had to understand the situation and had to fight and combat the situation, because it's not over. And even now with COVID-19, I believe there's like more victims. Like, think about it. How are the victims working in FAMs? How are they handling this COVID-19? Little kids working in mines right now, and thinking about that all the time, it brings me down, because labor trafficking is one of the most difficult experience that I don't wish for anybody. And it's something that, if you think about the slaves that were working in plantation being abused every day, dying, now there's this COVID-19, there are kids that are working in farm, men and women being locked up in houses. It's a lot. Next slide. Okay, so what am I doing now? Most of you probably know I work at Baker McKenzie law firm, and I'm on the Free the Slave board and the Human Trafficking Legal Center board, and I'm also a consultant with the Justice Department. I know I probably spoke so fast and I went too fast on my side. If there's something that you wanted to know that I didn't address as a survivor, please let me know and I can address it during the question section. I'll be here to respond to the question section. And I mean, I also like to recommend that, there's some recommendation. I really echo lawyers. If you're taking a case, try to give the victim to really understand and know the rules and the laws. They should know their rights. Work with that person. Work with the victim. Try to get them to be able to open up to you and for them to also understand. Before taking them to court, they need to understand what is awaiting them. Don't just take them there and just say, okay, do this, do that. Don't tell them what to do. Help them to understand the situation. All right, that's the end. Oh, I still have more slides. We're not going to talk about that. So I'll talk about this slide. So moving forward, I'm a big fan. Employing survivors, reunite them with their family, counseling, age is not a limit, and of course, financial services for survivors is important. And thank you guys.
Thank you so much, Evelyn. Your story is so important, and it is not only important, you are so courageous in sharing what has happened to you, and we so appreciate that, but your voice and the recommendations that you bring are so incredibly critical to those of us who are trying to make improvements in this area going forward. So thank you so much for that. In the time we have remaining, I'm going to share some further recommendations for courts that are hoping to craft innovative responses to labor trafficking survivors facing criminal charges. These recommendations are based in part on the data and experience that Colleen and Evelyn have so kindly presented. They are also based on my experience as a public defender representing human trafficking survivors in a human trafficking intervention court in New York City. And finally, these recommendations are based on a 2018 study done by the Yale Global Health Justice Partnership and the Sex Workers Project. Megan, could you? Great, thanks. In this study, the researchers conducted in-depth interviews with participants and social service providers involved in 42 prostitution, diversion, and human trafficking intervention programs across the whole country. Despite the best intentions of the stakeholders who designed these court interventions, the researchers found a number of unfortunate trends. One was that the court practices were often inconsistent or opaque, which served to keep participants in a state of anxiety and powerlessness. In addition, services were also often misaligned with the actual desires and structural needs of the participants. The study contains a lot of other really useful insights, so I highly recommend that court practitioners read the entire study, which is included in our handouts. In addition, here are just a handful of things court stakeholders should consider doing before thinking about trying to identify and serve survivors of labor trafficking. So again, I encourage all you court stakeholders listening to take some time to not only take in this information, but to go back to your court teams and brainstorm about what you can apply, what of this webinar you can apply to your day-to-day court practices. So first, we recommend that you ensure that the voices of survivors are incorporated into the creation of the program. Those closest to the problem are closest to the solution. Survivors know what survivors need. We must have survivors in leadership roles to ensure our efforts to respond to trafficking are effective. Next, it's recommended that you ensure that when you are creating a court intervention, you are not doing so in an echo chamber of criminal legal stakeholders. So bring in folks who are responding to labor trafficking in other contexts, such as immigration. One great suggestion Colleen had was to create a cross-system collaboration between outreach workers who screen for trafficking among those in immigration detention with criminal legal stakeholders. So work together to determine the prevalence of labor trafficking in your community and to devise a screening tool that is validated for your population. In addition, we encourage you to work on implementing screening and assessment tools, which are so incredibly important. Make sure you are consistently screening for labor trafficking and assessing survivor needs using validated tools. Ensure that you decide on what those tools will be in advance of actually seeking to serve labor trafficking survivors. Then once you're working with survivors, ensure that you are screening consistently and not generalizing or making assumptions based on the crime charged or the immigration status of the individual. We know based on the research that labor trafficking among U.S. citizens, including forced drug sale, is common, especially among homeless youth populations. Aim to build a compassionate and rehabilitative problem-solving model. This includes recognizing that involvement in the criminal legal system is inherently re-traumatizing to survivors. So instead of making onerous demands and requiring completion of lengthy programs, there should be a shift in the approach to resolving charges as expeditiously as possible and to merely introducing survivors to community-based and respected service providers. Additionally, in order to ensure that the court's involvement doesn't mimic the coercive practices of traffickers, courts must remove the threat of incarceration. Finally, courts should allow labor trafficking survivors to have voice and choice in the services that they are assigned to complete. Let the survivor tell you what their needs are. Respect their needs and goals, even when it may be in conflict with the court or the prosecutor's desire to investigate and prosecute labor traffickers. So those are just a few of many recommendations we have for courts looking to respond to labor trafficking. If you want to learn more and workshop how your home jurisdiction can better respond to all forms of trafficking, please apply for our training and technical assistance or reach out to us at mosaics@american.edu. Unfortunately, we don't have time for a question and answer period on this webinar, but if you would like to reach out to Colleen or Evelyn or dig into anything more about what they presented on today, please feel free to reach out to us at Mosaics and we will connect you with Evelyn or Colleen. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much to Evelyn and Colleen for sharing your insight and brilliance. And we hope to see you all again for our next quarterly webinar. Goodbye.